Good morning, everybody. How are you doing today? Whether it's 9 a.m. or 12 p.m., it's still technically morning. Let's be real, we're all bartenders here. And good morning to you. My name is Joe Nicole. I'm the National Whiskey Ambassador for all the whiskey we get to make at Midleton Distillery. Joining me today are Carol Quinn. She's the head of archives. And of course, our amazing Irish Distillers Academy tutor, Tommy Byrne. You'll be seeing a lot of him as this course goes as well. Now, if you're tuning in from YouTube and you're not in the cohort, what's happening here is we're back again. This is round 3 of cohort. We choose 50 F&B professionals across the U.S. to attend this wonderful course that once upon a time was only offered in Ireland. We have extended it here to the States virtually, so we're really excited to do that. And if you are in that cohort, make sure you're introducing yourself, you're saying who you are, where you're from in the chat, so we can talk to you and keep tabs on you. Now, I can't see you, or I would say it's good to see you. But it is good to be seen. It is good to be back. I've gotten to participate in this a few times now. And what's going to happen is over the course of about 5 weeks, you're going to learn everything from the history of Irish whiskey to the biology of the grain, all the way through the process into blending and projections and the future of Irish whiskey. It really is a lot to take in. And while it can be fun, it is going to challenge you a little bit as far as your studying goes. I know you guys have a lot going on with your lives, with your work, and with your families. So it does take some time to dedicate a little bit of yourself to this art. So Tuesdays, you're going to be meeting people from the distillery, a little eagle-eye view of what's happening in their category, for example. And then on Wednesday, just you students are going to dive in real deep with the tutors and learn some really, really cool things about Irish whiskey. Now, before we get into it and let these experts do their thing, I just want to touch on a couple of things for us real quick. If you could like us on Facebook, if you could subscribe to the channel on YouTube, if you can follow us on Instagram, and of course, like I said, make sure you're saying hello in that chat so we can keep tabs on who showed up today. And even more importantly, put all your questions there, because at the very end, we're going to have some more time with Carol to dive in on whatever you may be wondering about when it comes to the history of Irish whiskey or the history of John Jameson and our distillery. Now, we are almost 250 years old. And while a lot goes into that, making the whiskey, keeping the whiskey consistent, maturation, and all the things that have happened over those centuries, it's a lot to keep tabs on. And we're one of the very, very few distilleries that has an archivist, someone who specializes in the history of this so they can keep this thing together. She's like the glue of this whole thing. And she rarely gets to come be the face because she's hidden away in her little cottage with all of her trinkets and historical elements. But I'm so happy that she's here today. She has a wonderful audiobook that I'm sure she'll talk about. That is a 7-part series to help you even further as you're studying Jameson. But can I please welcome to the screen Carol Quinn, lead archivist of Midleton Distillery.
Hi, Joe. Thank you very much for that introduction. And I'm here with my colleague, Tommy Byrne, who is the tutor and international ambassador for the Irish Whiskey Academy here at Middleton. And Tommy, do you want to say?
Yeah, thanks, Carol. Yeah, I'm just going to say a very quick hello, guys. I'm going to be with you through the course, so you'll be sick in my face by 4 weeks' time. But just since it's the first class, came to say hello. There's nothing I can say about the history that Carol doesn't know. So yeah, Carol's going to be taking this class. I'm going to go have a poke around the archive, and I'll come back at the end and say goodbye. But enjoy the class, ask lots of questions. You're going to really enjoy it, and I'll see you at the end. Thanks, Carol.
Yeah, thank you, Tommy.
Thank you.
And thank you, Joe. And I think we're ready to get this stuck into some of the absolutely incredible history of Jameson Irish whiskey. And as Joe mentioned, I'm the head of archives here at Irish Distillers. And this is the outside of the building that I'm in at the moment. This is the distiller's cottage in the grounds of the old Midleton Distillery. Now, back in the day, the head distillers had to live on site. Distilling was a 24-hour operation, and there wasn't mechanized transport the way we have it today. And depending on where you were, you could be living in a kind of small, pokey apartment in a city centre, or if you're in Midleton Distillery, you were in this beautiful 24-room Georgian villa that we now call the Distiller's Cottage. But it's here that we store the documentary evidence of the history of our distilleries and our brands. And as Joe said, we're one of the very few distilling groups to have an archive. And certainly at the moment, we're the only Irish whiskey distillery that has its own archive. And what that means is we can talk about our history in a very, very authentic way because we have the documentary evidence of it. And the archive itself is an internal resource for the company. It's unfortunately not open to the public, but we do try and make the information here as widely available as possible. And to that end, we digitized over 100 years of the employee books. That's the records of the people employed at the Jameson Distillery between 1862 and 1969. And we have them available online via Ancestry, who partnered with us. So maybe, you know, give it a look sometime. Maybe your granddad worked for Jameson, which it would be a pretty cool thing. And it is something that we want to people all over the world, because as you know, Irish people have gone all over the world. The Irish diaspora is just huge. So it's very important to us to be able to reach out and share our history as widely as possible. So I'm going to now jump into the history of Irish whiskey and then specifically tell you a bit more about the history of Jameson. Now, Irish whiskey, as we understand it today, is very much a construct of the 18th century. That's when regulations first happen, when distilleries first become licensed here in Ireland, and the drink that we know and love today as Irish whiskey first evolves. And this chap that you're looking at here is not a distiller. He has nothing to do with it. But this is Dr. Samuel Johnson. And he wrote the first dictionary of the English language. And that's the very large tome you see him leaning on there. And of course, we cut through to W. What is he saying about whiskey? The Irish sort is particularly distinguished for its pleasant and mild flavour. Yum. And he contrasts it. The Highland sort is somewhat hotter, and by corruption in Scotch, they call it whiskey. So you can see, even at the very, very beginning, these are two separate drinks that we're talking about. And there is nothing to say that you can't enjoy both, but they are very, very different with different histories. And one of the reasons for that is this malt tax. Applied in 1785, it was a tax on malt, which is malted barley, which was the main raw ingredient for whiskey at that point. Ireland and Scotland were part of the United Kingdom of Great Britain, but this law applied in Ireland and not Scotland. So what it meant is that the Irish distillers paid tax twice. They paid tax on their raw ingredient, the malted barley, and then they paid tax on the output, the whiskey. Breaking news, nobody likes paying tax twice. So what the Irish distillers started doing was introduced a whole new mash bill that had malted and unmalted barley. And then they realized they really liked it, and their customers really liked it. So there's a survey done in 1832, and out of a total production in Ireland of Irish whiskey of 8 million gallons, only 70,000 was what we would call all malt or pure malt or single malt. And that's simply because people preferred pot still. And that was the malted and unmalted barley mash bill. And it becomes the signature style of Irish whiskey. So when we're talking about Irish whiskey historically, usually you can be pretty confident that you're talking about single pot still. That's Irish whiskey from a single distillery made from a mash bill of malted and unmalted barley. And it was the opportunities offered in Dublin, which at the time, back in 1780, when this man, that I'm sure is going to be familiar to a lot of you, John Jameson himself, when he first established his family's tradition of distilling in Ireland. He was Scottish by birth, and he was actually a lawyer by profession. But Dublin at the time, it was the second city of the British Empire. It was a glamorous place to be. It was a bustling place, and it was a place of great opportunity for entrepreneurs. So he established the distillery that bears his name and became known as John Jameson and Son, making Dublin whiskey, which means pot still. So no man is an island, they tell me, and he didn't do it alone. And John Jameson wanted to set up a business that could be generational, that could be passed on through the Jameson family. And so helping with that is his wife, Peggy, who we see here, mother to his 16 children. So a round of applause there for Peggy. So the Jameson family continued to invest in and develop the Jameson Distillery on the original site in Bow Street. And you can see here that although they were very entrepreneurial and very imaginative when it came to their whiskey, less so imaginative when it comes to family names. And you've got 4 John Jamesons, one after the other. And when I first started working here in the archive, the memory that there was 4 Johns was gone. And I was looking at these documents, all signed by the same guy, thinking, is this fellow immortal? You know, how can he be living this long? But there was actually father follows son, grandson, great-grandson, all with the same name. And in 1905, they go mad, and an Andrew Jameson finally breaks the cycle. And the Bow Street Distillery, from the early days, it would have been quite small, almost a backyard facility. And in fact, the earliest stills that we have records of are exactly the same size as the micro distillery that we have here on site in Middleton. So anybody who gets the chance to come here, remember that when you're looking at the micro distillery, that was the beginning of the Bow Street Distillery. But by the 1880s, it's grown to the size that you see here in this image. It actually covered 6 acres of Dublin city centre. It was absolutely huge. And this is another point of difference between the Irish distilling tradition and the Scottish tradition. In Scotland, you tend to have very, very small distilleries that are located in rural areas. And very often, they can't produce enough liquid to form a brand. So you get the rise of middlemen or blenders who buy spirit from a number of small distilleries and blend them together. And where you find a whiskey that hasn't been blended comes from a single distillery, it's known as single malt in the Scottish tradition. Now in Ireland, it's very different. The distilleries tend to be very, very large, and they tend to be set in an urban setting, and they never need to mix their liquid. So you didn't have the rise of those blenders or middlemen that you did have in Scotland. So the Jameson Distillery, as you're looking at it here in the 1880s, it was a self-sufficient village in the city of Dublin. And once you went through those doors, it had everything it needed itself to make the fantastic whiskey that it became world renowned for. And even in this lovely little etching, you can see in the foreground there, these horse-drawn carts bringing barrels of whiskey out to the customers. Even those carts were made in-house in the distillery. The distillery employed carpenters. It employed leather makers to make the harnesses for the horses. You had blacksmiths, coppersmiths, coopers, ostlers. It was a small town of craftspeople, all united under the distilling team to make Jameson whiskey. And they're making it not just for Ireland, but for the world. They saw their product as the equal to, if not better than, any spirit being produced anywhere in the world, and they proudly sent it out. And here in the archive, we have those records. We have the labels from the different countries that the whiskey was going to. So there's a fantastic 15-year-old whiskey heading off to New York City. And here are some others, South Africa. This at the top, you can see one, it's the 1940s. It's 1919. It's going to India. You know, this is somewhere that you mightn't have been expecting Jameson whiskey to be exported to, but it was. Here are some labels for Australia and also one for South America, our friends down in Argentina. It in Buenos Aires, they're importing Irish whiskey, and it's the drink of the connoisseur. It is an expensive drink. It is not, in many cases, the drink of the Irish diaspora, because if you're laying railroad tracks and you're digging mines, you probably don't have the money to afford Irish whiskey. It is a premium product. So if you are drinking fine cognacs and champagnes, Irish whiskey is also on your sideboard. And what that meant back at home for the distillery is that at any one point, there's up to 1 million gallons of Jameson whiskey maturing under the streets of Dublin in the caverns. And you can see here one of the maturation cellars at Bow Street. And the whiskey in those days could only be stacked 3 barrels high, because that's as far as a man could reach. These are very, very heavy. These are oak casks filled with spirit. You don't, lift them lightly. But of course, there was always the danger of fire. You can imagine a spark or a thrown cigarette just ripping through these cellars. And if you can see just down the middle of the pathway of this image, there's kind of a cylindrical, conical little implement. That's the fire extinguisher. So best of luck with that. But it was always a constant threat for the Irish distilleries, because remember, 1 million gallons of spirit maturing under the distillery at any one time. So the distillery, Jameson, like many of the others, had 2 routes to market. They could choose to bottle in-house themselves, or they could sell in bulk to spirit merchants known as bonders. And some of these bonders would just bottle and sell immediately, but there were 2 in particular who treated the whiskey a little bit differently. And these were the firms Mitchell & Son and the firm W&A Gilbey. Now, both of these were large importers of wines and sherries, and they were importing that liquid in oak casks, because that's what an oak cask is. It's a container for the transportation of liquid. So it meant that once they'd imported their wine or their sherry, they had all these empty casks, and they're going to the distillery and paying for more casks. So they said, well, actually, if we bring our own empty casks, can we get them filled with your whiskey? And would that save us, a buck or 2? And the distillery said, sure. And because these large merchants had duty-free warehouses, the whiskey stayed there a little bit longer. And what evolved is what we know today as cask finish. But at the time, this was absolutely revolutionary. So they realized the whiskey tastes differently. It's spirit from the Jameson Distillery, but it now tastes differently. So it needs its own name. And in the case of Mitchell & Son, they call their whiskey after the spots of paint that they would daub on the casks so they could distinguish how old the whiskey was in each barrel. So green spot, it meant a 10-year-old single pot still from the Jameson Distillery being matured by the firm Mitchell & Son. And across Dublin City, you had Redbreast, the same thing, maturing in the sherry casks belonged to the firm W&A Gilbey, but it is the spirit coming from the Jameson Distillery. So at any one time in the 1930s in Dublin, you could go into one of the fantastic pubs and you would have Jameson directly from the distillery. You could have Green Spot, Jameson matured by Mitchell & Son, or you could have Redbreast, Jameson matured in a different way by W&A Gilbey. Now, sadly, Green Spot and Redbreast weren't exported in those days, so you really had to come to Dublin to enjoy the taste. But today, they're a little bit more widely available. And the distillery was home to generations of employees. The Jamesons were known to be very good employers, and they were very considerate employers. And in an age before there was anything like an old age pension, they ensured that if they had an employee who was getting on in years, but who didn't have family to support him, he would get a softer and softer job and be able to remain in the distillery. And this was noted in 1886 by a journalist called Alfred Bernard, who visited. And he said there were a lot of ancient greybeards there, but it was a kindness in an era before things like old age pensions. And as well as people, there was a lot of animal activity. You're looking at some of the horses here who not only delivered the barley, which is what you can see happening in this picture, to Bow Street, the Jameson Distillery, and took the barrels of whiskey away. So there were stables on site, and there were men known as ostlers who would look after the horses. And this is an image of a man called James Leach, and he worked in the distillery as a clerk in the spirit store, and basically a type of accountant. And it was his job to keep track of all the barrels of whiskey that were now ready for sale and where they were going to and what customers had bought them. But this man in particular really, really loved animals. And his granddaughter, in fact, got in touch with me, and she told me this story about her grandfather, that every day in his lunch break, he liked to come down from the office that he worked in, visit the stables, and just meet and greet the Jameson horses. He would bring them an apple, he'd bring them a carrot, and he absolutely loved animals. And this was a part of his daily routine. And he had an incredible 53-year career in the distillery. And he lived in one of the Jameson houses built by the Jameson family in the streets nearby. And when he died, his granddaughter told me, his funeral cortege was brought past the gates of the distillery, and all the horses were brought out to say goodbye to their old friend. And it gives you an idea of the warmth and the family atmosphere that existed in the distillery at that time. And the Jameson family really understood that it took a team to make their whiskey, that it wasn't just the distiller, it wasn't just one person, it was the team. And I always say, if you were the person whose job it was to open the door in the morning or open the gates, it didn't matter if you're the greatest distiller in the world. If the door isn't open, he isn't getting in. So it takes a team. And over 100 years ago, the Jameson family came up with this little emblem that we call the Jameson Barrelman. And this little figure, since about 1926, has been on every bottle ever since. And he symbolizes the entire team, that we all work together to make Jameson whiskey. And just think, this little device came up at a time when there was no such thing as a HR department, and there really wasn't any such thing as a marketing department either. It was a very, very genuine recognition by the Jameson family of all the crafts that came together to make their whiskey. And the original function of the barrelman on a label or on a bottle, and if you can see it on his barrel that he's carrying there, it has the Roman numerals V11, meaning a 7-year-old whiskey. So when you saw him on the label, it meant a 7-year-old single pot still whiskey. And that was the standard age that Jameson was sold on for quite some time. And the whiskey was highly regarded, not just in Ireland, not just in Europe, but really worldwide. And this emblem of the 3-star that you see on the label, that shone out, and it was often known in Dublin pubs as Jameson 3-star. People would say, give me a glass of 3-star. And again, another symbol of the quality. So what happened to Irish whiskey? You know, where did things start going wrong? You have this incredible liquid, and it's been sold globally, and it's been made by such a committed and such a talented team back in the distillery. Well, the 20th century was not kind to Irish whiskey. And that decline kind of kicks off with the First World War. Round about 1914, Ireland is an island on the edge of Europe. And when the war broke out, there was a lot of submarine activity around the island of Ireland. And that meant that the merchant shipping that was carrying the whiskey all over the world was being sunk. So really, they just couldn't get it out to their consumer. But, you know, they were pragmatic people, and the records here show they just put their head down and they kept on distilling. And the records that I have here show that in 1919, the Jameson Distillery had its best distillation season ever. Everything was working perfectly. The barley was of the highest standard, the stills were working, and the output was greater than it had ever been before, which was misfortunate because that is the year before we head into prohibition in the United States. So the United States at that point was not the biggest market for Irish whiskey, but it was an important market. However, the Jamesons as a family were very, very ethical people. They treated their workers properly. They did a lot of volunteer roles in Irish society. They, in fact, many of them served on the boards of Irish Lights. That's the body that looks after the lighthouses around the island of Ireland. And if a country said, do not sell your goods here, it is illegal to do so, they had no interest in breaking the law. And you will find no records of any attempt by the distillery to smuggle whiskey into the US during Prohibition, which is actually kind of a great thing because it means they did not collaborate with the criminal element at any point. So in 1934, Prohibition is lifted, yay. And the image that you're looking at is the first shipment of Jameson back into the US once Prohibition is lifted. And no sooner as that happy day arrives, then you go straight into the Second World War. And it's the same thing again. They cannot get the goods out of the country. And by the time the Second World War is finished, Europe is in ruins. Things are tough in America as well. We've broken away from the British Empire. We no longer have markets in India, in Canada, in Australia, in New Zealand. And you have now 4 decades of being unable to export your product in the way that you wanted to. So that means year on year, income has dropped in the distilleries. And some of them at this point now are fighting for survival. And it gets so bad that by the 1960s, there's only 3 distilleries left operating in the in the Republic of Ireland. And it's not that they just, threw their hands up and they gave up. They tried everything. They're constantly innovating. They're constantly thinking of new ways to delight and inspire the consumer. And in 1963, Jameson, which had traditionally preferred to sell in bulk to bonders and publicans, decided to bottle in-house in the distillery themselves for the first time. And what you're looking at here is the actual invitation from 1963 to come to the distillery and to taste this exciting new product, which we now know today as Jameson Crested. And it was distinguished as it was the distillery the brand that was bottled in-house in the Jameson Distillery, whereas traditional Jameson had been sold to third parties to be bottled by them. So they're not giving up the fight. They really are innovating all the time and thinking of new ways to connect with the consumer. But it's just too difficult. And the economic cards are stacked against them. So you do get to the point in the 1960s that there's only 3 distilleries left making Irish whiskey in Ireland. This drink that had conquered the world, that was known globally, it is now shrunk to just the domestic market of Ireland. And those 3 distilleries are the John Jameson and Son Distillery in Dublin, John Power and Son Distillery also in Dublin, and down here in Cork, the Midleton Distillery, run by the Cork Distilleries Company. And they're still family owned at this point. They're still being run by the descendants of their founders, and they still crucially believe in their product. They still believe Irish whiskey has a future, and a future not only in delighting the palates of consumers, but a future in giving employment to Ireland, providing a way for Irish families to have income. not only in the cities where the whiskey is being made, but to the agricultural communities growing the barley that goes into making the whiskey. So they're really visionary people. And they realize that to survive, they have to do something completely unprecedented. They're going to have to pool their resources, come together and merge into one entity if they are going to survive at all. So these three companies that have been business rivals for generations, it takes 2 years of negotiations before they can fully come to an agreement with each other. But they do, because they all have the same vision of getting Irish whiskey back out to the world, showing the world how great Irish whiskey is. And they make a lot of tough decisions very early on. And one of those decisions is the style of whiskey. Single pot still had been the style most associated with Irish whiskey. But by the 1960s, it had fallen out of favour with the consumer. Consumers were looking for lighter, more approachable, more mixable drinks. They wanted a whiskey that worked well in a cocktail. They felt that pot still was slightly heavier, a bit more difficult. So in 1968, Jameson becomes a blend for the first time. And that is the year, 1968, that you first see the iconic green bottle. So prior to that, it had been single pot still produced by the John Jameson and Son Distillery. After 1968, it becomes a blended drink that is a blend of grain whiskey and pot still whiskey. And I'm quite sure Tommy will be going through the differences and all about that in a lot more detail. But while looking to the future with this new blended drink, they did not turn their back on the past. And the colours of the bottle, the green of the bottle, the cream of the label, the maroon of the cap, all those are colours that you find on the stained glass back at the Bow Street Distillery. So while they're very, very future focused, they are still incredibly proud of the past and where they've come from. And the next major change that happens is they combine where they produce the whiskey. So the wonderful Bow Street Distillery in Dublin, which had originally, back in 1780, been at the edge of Dublin city, had now been swallowed up by the city, and it was no longer fit for purpose. It was okay when you had your barley arriving in on a horse and cart, but you couldn't get modern tankers in and out. But down in the historic Midleton Distillery, there was a greenfield site adjacent. So in 1975, they built what was at the time Europe's most modern distillation plant, what we call New Middleton, in the grounds of Old Middleton. And what you're looking at there is the incredible garden stillhouse of New Middleton. And just behind it is the beautiful stonework of Old Middleton. And very snug in there, not too far from where you see that very tall chimney, is where I am right now in the distiller's cottage in Old Middleton. So from 1975, production of Jameson was moved to Midleton in County Cork. Still in Ireland, still proudly an Irish whiskey. And what was incredibly unique about the design of New Middleton was it was designed specifically to be able to make the different styles of the three companies that had come together to form Irish distillers. It could still produce a signature style of Jameson, signature style of Powers, and of course, the signature style of Midleton whiskey. And that had never happened in an Irish distillery before. But still, it was still tough trying to get the word out that Jameson Irish whiskey was worth drinking. And it wasn't until 1988 that the company Irish Distillers merges with the international group Pernod Ricard that really we see the beginning of the new era for Irish whiskey. And what Pernod Ricard gave us was a distribution network. They didn't tell us how to distill. We knew how to distill. They didn't come along and say, you know, you need to change things. They said, we believe in you and we will help you get your whiskey out to the world. And that's what they did for us. They gave us a route to market. So since that point, Jameson has been going back to where it had been before and being a new taste experience for so many people. And that's all the marketing has ever been about, is trying to get a glass to somebody to let them know what a really, really wonderful drink it is. And of course, it's been incredibly successful. There has been year on growth, simply because once somebody has tried it, they really, really enjoy it. And it has been fantastic to see the growth, especially in the US, of Jameson. People who had never experienced Irish whiskey before suddenly becoming absolutely huge fans of the whole category of Irish whiskey. But we've never forgotten where it all began. We've never forgotten what has been really, really important to us. And the historic Bow Street Distillery in Dublin, you can still visit that same site today that has been the site of whiskey making since 1780. It's proudly our brand home, the Jameson Distillery at Bow Street. And you can visit there. You can learn everything about the production of Jameson Irish whiskey. And of course, you can enjoy a glass of whiskey or a fantastic cocktail made there. And it is still our spiritual heart and home. And, you know, if you're really going to have a good time, you should visit Bow Street in Dublin and then come on down to Middleton and see where Jameson is being made today, still in the heart of Ireland. And the success of what we call Jameson Original, and in building up a whole new consumer base, has allowed us to widen the family, to introduce different styles of Jameson, not least the absolutely fantastic Jameson Black Barrel. And it is wonderful to see people who've started maybe with Jameson Original just reach out and just see what else is there. And maybe you'd like to try something, or Distiller's Batch, which harks back to single pot still, the original style. But for me, I don't think you can go wrong with a whiskey sour made from Black Barrel. I think that's something very, very special. So this has been, you know, really a whistle-stop tour into the history of Irish whiskey and specifically Jameson. But for anyone who'd like to learn a bit more, you know, dive in a little deeper, we do have a podcast. It's available on Spotify or wherever. And it just talks a little bit more about the background and gives you more of a deep dive into the formation of Irish distillers and some of the personalities who were involved in that. And I think that's bringing me to the end of the formal part, the presentation. So I'm more than delighted, Joe, if there's any questions, if you can let me know.
Of course, yeah. Thank you so much, Carol. I'm sure I'm echoing what everyone else is thinking in the chat. I just love hearing you talk about it. And if you guys are wondering, she's not available to read you bedtime stories to fall asleep to.
Maybe I am.
She's very expensive. No, that was wonderful. We love diving in and hearing all about the history of Irish whiskey, and specifically John Jameson, and how we kind of set the trend, if you will, and set the stage for greatness. And to this day, we still are. About 3/4 of the category are Jameson drinkers across the world, which is very incredible. We do have some questions in there. Looks like we are starring them now. I know you can't see it, Carol, but they were very active. I was actively chatting away with them too. This group is, I can tell, is going to be a fun, active group. Not that the other two weren't, but you guys are doing a great job with the chat. I appreciate that.
Brilliant.
Some of these questions are a little ahead of themselves. We're going to learn some things as we go over the next month. We're going to get into the science with some other amazing guest speakers and guest appearances. But there are some questions here that I think we can throw at you, Carol, to kind of help answer. Sure. One comes from Diana. She was very active. Thank you for being active and asking questions, Diana. She asks, and this could be also for the blending or the maturation portion too, but I already kind of briefly discussed this with them in the chat, that sherry casks were before American oak. But she wants to know, did sherry casks happen first in Ireland and then in Scotland, or simultaneously? if you wanted to speak to the history of casks coming over to Ireland.
I would say I'm not entirely sure of the answer to that. I know we have records of sherry Jameson from, gosh, the 1870s, 1860s. So I'm not sure. You'd have to ask my Scottish counterparts. But I feel Irish whiskey traditionally had more of those sherry notes than Scotch traditionally. And it's certainly very, very strong in the Jameson tradition to be finished in sherry casks.
And then, I do not know this person's name, but it is Decap Media. Might have this turned around a little bit. So their question is, what I am hearing is that Mitchell & Sons was the reason Jameson's reputation grew. But I would say Jameson was very reputable, and then we created...
the firm Mitchell & Son, who are still going today and still run Johnny Mitchell, a magnificent person. They were wine importers based in Dublin, and they really never expanded much outside of Dublin, and they didn't send their products internationally. So Green Spot, as originated in the 1920s by the Mitchells, would not have been really exported. So I would say maybe twist that around, and Jameson is the reason why more people know today of Mitchell & Son as being where Green Spot originated.
Yeah. What is also pretty neat about the Spot bottles, it's one of the few whiskeys, if not maybe the only Irish whiskey, one of the few whiskeys internationally that still name drop the bonder or the merchant on the bottle. It's still
which is lovely, and we still have that very personal connection with the Mitchell family, and they often come down to the distillery here, and you'd find them sniffing around the maturation warehouses just checking on things.
It's a very cool shop if you ever get to go to Dublin to go check it out. And then we're going to get into another question, and the question is, what percentage of Jameson went to the U.S. before Prohibition in terms of total production or exports?
We actually don't have those figures because Ireland at that point was part of the UK. And so we don't have those records, but it wasn't huge. It wouldn't have been a primary market at all. Around 1919, 1920, Jameson has been sold in Canada, New Zealand, Australia, India, all across Europe. It would have been primarily around the East Coast, really, in the US, and maybe a little bit around San Francisco.
And this is the question about advertising, because there was a lot of really cool clips of old marketing and old advertising and the old labels. But who were Jameson's advertising and marketing partners in the 1960s?
Oh, you're putting it up to me now. We have files and files and files, but I'd have to nip down into the strong rooms. I'm sorry to look that up. But what I will do, Joe, is I will look that up and I will leave you know, and you can share that in one of the future classes.
For sure. Yeah, no, that sounds great. We always have found a way to partner ourselves with the right people. Now, of course, we partner with the NFL and MLS and musicians. It's a whole new world in 2026. But next question coming from Nanette. When did women become a more important part of distillation or distribution? And when did you start, Carol?
I started working here 13 years ago, and there would have been very few other females, and that would not have been unusual in Irish distilling. And I could spend a whole hour on that, and it was nothing peculiar to the world of distilling that you didn't find women in management. That was societal. Up until 1980 in Ireland, a married woman did not control her own bank account. So if you were a business person and if you were female and you went to get a loan from a bank manager, your husband had the legal right to tell the bank manager not to give you the loan. So that has a societal implication in that people then don't want to do business with women, because if you don't control your finances, you're not somebody that is considered, you know, a serious business person. Now, thankfully, that has changed, but we do get inherent biases from that era that is still there. But Irish Distillers, I must say in particular, has been very strong through its graduate program of bringing in new entrants into the distilling industry. And it is almost every year, certainly since I've been here, there have been more female graduates come in through the graduate program than male. So at the moment, the manager of our distillery, Jamie Jordan, is female. Our blending team, 2/3 are female. In the maturation warehouses, the what we call the bond supervisors, there's a number of female supervisors. So even from when I started 13 years ago, it has been absolutely incredible to see the amount of women enter into the profession, but there has been a very, very strong vision in Irish distillers to open those doors and encourage more females in, especially through the STEM, the science, fields into Irish distilling. And we actually had an event here in Middleton about a month ago for International Women's Day, and we had a Women in Whiskey event, and there was 80 women all working at different aspects, production, marketing, hospitality in Irish whiskey, all here networking, introducing themselves to each other, and it was absolutely fantastic.
That's amazing. And to echo that even further, here in the States, the brand manager and assistant brand manager on Jameson are women. One is Irish, and half of my team are Irish women who went through the program in Ireland too. So brilliant. very much pro ladies getting it done for John Jameson. Yeah. On to the next question from Kim. Is the Bow Street Distillery still producing anything for distribution?
No, production stopped in Bow Street when the distillery down here in Middleton was built. But there is still a maturation warehouse in Bow Street. Now, it's very small because, again, the city has grown up around it. And as you can imagine, the Dublin fire officer isn't so keen anymore in having too many gallons of raw spirit in what is a very residential area. So we are maturing whiskey on the site, but we don't produce anymore in the Bow Street Distillery.
There's one beautiful expression of Jameson. It's a Jameson 18 year. There are two expressions. One is called Bow Street. And
that's right.
That is aged there for like a year. Just to say that it is, to give it a little Bow Street credibility. But you guys will probably dive into that in one of these classes. They definitely touch on that. Okay, and Marielle, apologies if it's Marielle or Marielle. She wants to know, what year was Bow Street opened?
Oh, the original distillery. All our earliest labels, 1780. And interestingly, that's the first year that distilleries are licensed in Ireland. So it's the beginning of the modern era of whiskey making in Ireland.
Yeah. Yeah. Oh man, this next question is stealing one of my questions that I like to end with. I always like to get to know Carol a little bit more. This question comes from Decap again. It says, Carol, what did you do to prepare for your role as head of archives? How does someone become head of archives for a brand? And I was also going to ask you to tell them kind of where you came from and how you got into history and archives.
Oh, sure. Yeah, no, I'm always delighted to answer that because I'm an archivist by training and by profession. And it's actually a postgraduate qualification. And sometimes people don't understand that part and give themselves the title of archivist, but you actually need a primary degree to begin with. Usually it's history, but it doesn't have to be. My degree was history. And then it's here in Ireland, it's an MA offered by University College Dublin, but there's many other places in the UK and in Scotland that you can train as an archivist. And what the core training is the selection of what needs to be preserved, because you can't preserve everything. So what archives are is something that you preserve because of its unique information content. So the training is in the selection of the archives. It's then on the management and preservation of the archives, because sometimes things have survived by chance and we don't want to have any more chance. So all our strong rooms here are temperature, humidity regulated. We've UV filters in all our lighting and on all our windows. And then it's the dissemination of the information, whether that's through cataloging, which would be the more traditional style, or what we're doing here, Joe, in this sort of chat, is sharing the information. So I'm an archivist first, and I had worked in the university sector here in Ireland And luckily, I'm from Cork, which is where the distillery was. So it wasn't much of a hop between the university and here. So I suppose I was an archivist first before I became involved with Irish distillers.
Pretty awesome. So basically, she's like the Indiana Jones of Irish whiskey, and we're very fortunate to hang out with her for a little bit, or Laura Croft, if you will. You'd rather be Tomb Raider. That's up to you, Carol. This question comes from Paul, and this is another one of the questions I like to ask. You guys are killing it with the questions. What is the lesser known moment in Jameson history that you think should define the brand more than it currently does? I'm sure you come across some pretty cool notes and find tidbits here and there. What are some things that you think are pretty interesting?
Jeepers, that's a good question. And I don't think it's any one moment. I think it's how the consumer was always front and center of everything that Jameson did. Because at the end of the day, unless your consumer is enjoying your whiskey, and the Jameson interpretation of that was producing the highest quality possible. And in the era when they would sell in bulk to publicans who would then bottle on site on their own premises, the distillery would supply the labels for the bottles. But sometimes you get unscrupulous publicans and they would bottle maybe an inferior, a cheaper whiskey and call it Jameson, or they might water it down so that the consumer wasn't getting the high quality that the distillery wanted them to do. So the distillery would hire pub spies, which sounds like a really good job. And they would go and they would order a glass of neat Jameson, but they wouldn't drink it. They'd put it into a small little bottle and they'd bring it back to the laboratory in Bow Street where it would be tested.
Wow.
And if it was found to not be Jameson or Jameson that had been interfered with, the distillery would make the publican take out a public apology in the newspaper. And he wasn't apologizing to the distillery. He's apologizing to the consumer because it's the consumer he cheated. So I suppose that the absolute commitment to consumer enjoyment and quality has always been a hallmark of Jameson.
Wow. That's pretty cool. I actually didn't know that story. That's like almost a little Tommy Shelby, a little Peaky Blinders. Yeah. Things are getting done correctly.
Yeah.
I love that.
Slightly more gentle.
Question, that's a great question. This next one comes from Nisa, I believe. Apologies again if I get your name wrong. What percentage of the whiskey stays in Ireland? Were or are there any rules around how much can be exported? That's a great question.
No. No, absolutely not. And year on year, with the success and growth of Jameson, we've had to expand the distillery here. So there's never a set percentage that stays in Ireland or that is exported. It's wherever somebody wants to enjoy a glass of Jameson, we're happy to send it.
Absolutely.
And we grow the distillery so that we can continue that supply. But interestingly, we still get all our barley from a 200-kilometer radius around the distillery here in Midleton. So everyone is getting a really true taste of Ireland, no matter where you're drinking it.
That part is special. You can try to reduce, you think of these massive global brands and surely they're not reducing their carbon footprint, but you really can't. You really can't find ways to do your best to keep things local. You guys are going to learn a little bit more about that tomorrow as far as the farms go. And yeah, we can export as much as we want. You'll learn this too, but we have over 2 million barrels, which is like 750 million liters of booze, and we're continuing to grow. So the number is astronomical.
Yeah.
And this is a nice question. And this person says, first off, thank you, Carol. What is your favorite part about working for Jameson?
I think it's the people here. It's a really fun place to work. It's a really inclusive place. There is a great team ethic here of support across all the different divisions. And I'd say it's actually doing what we're doing right now, Joe, is sharing that story. Early on, met some of my colleagues, had a nice cup of coffee, and now get to share the history. What's not to like?
I completely agree. It is a privilege to work on such an amazing brand, and I love working for Pernod Ricard and working on Irish whiskey. But I also say that it's really the vessel for the communication, and the vessel is amazing. We get to have this amazing vessel, but really it's just acts as getting us together to have these talks, and it's just an amazing vessel to have. And we'll get on to the next question. There's only a few more left, I think. People
Sure.
are asking away. This comes from Cam's Cocktails. Sounds like a cool business, Cam. The question is, does the Jameson family have any connection to Irish poutine, Irish moonshine, in parentheses, makers, any connection to the makers before they started the distillery?
No, poutine, quite rightly, as Cam's Cocktail tells us there, Irish moonshine. That was something traditionally made on a very, very small scale, you know, out in the hills and the mountains of the most inaccessible parts of Ireland, and it would be for very local consumption. The Jameson family, having a legal background, you know, would not have been that interested in the whole production of poutine or moonshine. So no, they came straight into whiskey making.
Yeah. Although tasting it off the still is pretty neat before it goes into the barrels.
It's a pretty strong experience.
There is. This next one comes from, I believe, is it Kieran? The question is, as cocktails become more popular earlier this century, were there any specifically that Jameson was self-advocating, any punches or anything like that? Great question.
Yeah, so punch traditionally in Ireland is drunk hot. So it's warm. So it's hot spiced whiskey, and the couple punch would be a very traditional thing. So Jameson would have promoted hot whiskies, but also they very strongly promoted in the 1960s Irish coffee, because that was seen as something that needed specifically Irish whiskey. So that was one that they really, really latched onto. The more modern exploration of Irish whiskey for cocktails is actually quite modern. So it would have been in the early days, about 1900, 1910, whiskey and soda would have been the way to drink it, and then evolving more into the Irish coffee and more of the older style cocktails to the absolute explosion that we have today.
Yeah. Hot whiskey is great. If you're on a little road trip across Ireland, you can go into any pub and get yourself a hot whiskey anywhere. And this is one of my favorite drinks. And of course, the Irish coffee, which was created over there at the Foynes Air Base before it became an airport.
Yeah.
The Irish coffee really is probably what put it on the map in USA as far as the cocktail.
Pretty much, I would say so. Yeah, yeah.
And then it kind of spun out from there. One of my favorites is a Tipperary. Have you had a Tipperary, Carol?
I don't think I have.
Oh.
You're going to have to come over, Joe, and make me one.
That's fair. I'll see you in like a month.
In the background here, Tommy is laughing.
Yeah, Tommy's definitely had one.
Tommy's had a Tipperary.
This next question comes from Natalie. She says, you mentioned that Jameson was an expensive whiskey. When they moved from a single pot still to blended, did the price of the bottle go down?
It's always hard to compare. The price would have come down a little, but it stayed in the premium space. It's always considered itself as a premium drink. So yeah, in relation to a full bottle of single pot still, the blended was more economically accessible, but it still had all the hallmarks of a top quality product, a premium product.
Yeah. This is, I can't tell if this is a thank you or maybe a question built into a thank you, but Decap responding to your answer saying that's so fascinating. Thank you. Very curious of how the archive informs spirit development, policies, methodologies, culture.
Yeah, so as I mentioned at the start, the archive is an internal resource for Irish distillers. So the distilling team often would pop down and they would have a look at historic mash bills. Not to try and recreate them, but to use them as jumping off points, as somewhere that can inspire. So the recent reintroduction, for example, of a Jameson single pot still, Jameson Distiller's Batch, came from the distilling team having a conversation, much as we're having now, learning about the history of Jameson, and just saying, how would we interpret that for now, for our consumers right now? So it's used in that an awful lot. And he mentions their culture. I do work with our HR department an awful lot, because the barrel man, introduced over 100 years ago as a symbol of our values, is still as relevant today. So it's actually showing the historical evolution of that with our current system of values. So the archive is integrated into everything he's saying there.
Awesome. Well, great question. And this next one comes from Haley or Hallie. What happened to the local community during the major wars, prohibition? How did Jameson handle the lives of those who depended on the distillery? Did they keep them, or did they have to make some hard decisions?
Well, the decline, it was a steady decline during over, we're talking a 40-year period. So when somebody would come up to retire, they generally weren't replaced. There was this almost natural shrinkage in the distillery, and there was no new recruitment. So that's how they handled it. Yeah. And when Irish Distilleries was formed in 1966, there was a lot of reorganization, and some people who were coming to, the end of their working career chose to go at that point. Others chose to move to the other sites. We have a bottling plant in Dublin. So a lot of the employees at the Jameson Distillery in Bow Street just transferred down the road to the bottling plant. But it had been just a system of shrinkage, really, rather than massive cut-offs.
Yeah. This one comes from, this is Husky. This is Husky Boy. Great username. I imagine you have a pet husky or something. It says, you mentioned the blended bottle in 1968 having history with the stained glass in Bow Street. Could you tell us more about the significance of the colors that we chose for the bottle?
I would love to be able to tell you about the significance of the colors, but George Jameson, who installed that stained glass back in the 1890s, didn't leave me a handy note explaining. So all I know is that those were the colors chosen by George Jameson, who is the head of production in the 1890s in the distillery, and he put them in. So maybe they had some family significance, maybe they didn't, but I'm afraid the records don't tell me.
Yeah. Not sure if we'll be able to touch on this one. This could be something that we don't really get to talk about publicly, but this says, can you comment a little about the 90s when CNC purchased Tullamredu and Cooley Distillery started production? The question is about any second now.
Great. I think I'd need to actually read that. Yeah, so I think what he's talking about there is actually the resurgence in the 1990s, the beginning of the resurgence of Irish whiskey. I mentioned 1988 was a game changer, and that's when Pernod Ricard gave us the distribution network. But there was also the beginning of the reignition of some other Irish distilleries, because for a period during the 1980s, Middleton was the only distillery in Ireland operating. Yeah. And then you had new startups such as Cooley. And also remember 1984, slightly before this period, is when Midleton Very Rare is launched on the scene. And that was a signifier by the then head distiller Barry Crockett that the whiskey coming from New Midleton was every bit as good, if not better, than Old Midleton. So that, I think, inspired the whole category. And so you did have older distilleries such as Tullamredu revamping up, and new distilleries such as Cooley coming on stream. Yeah. So the 90s were an exciting but tough time for Irish whiskey.
Yeah. What last question here looks like from Paul. What's the most fascinating artifact or document you've come across in the archives?
Well, we have one notebook. I was actually looking at it only recently, and it's from 1826, so exactly 200 years ago. And it's the private pocket notebook of John Jameson II, who was a hands-on distiller in Bow Street. And it's a small little notebook, and in it he's writing his daily mash bills, the daily distillation of Jameson. So to think, he held this in his hand, he wrote down the mash bill for Jameson, but the distillery was still quite small at that point. And when he closed it one day, he tracked actual grains of barley amongst the binding of the notebook. And 200 years later, we can look at those actual grains of barley still there that were being used to make Jameson whiskey 200 years ago. And there aren't, I think, Tommy, you'll agree, too many brands that have that direct lineage. And that, I think that's pretty cool. That's a pretty fascinating thing.
Maybe one day science will catch up and we'll clone the original seed and make a new expression of Jameson.
Maybe we will.
Yeah, or we don't. We all saw Jurassic Park. Sometimes doing that doesn't really work out for me. No, I believe that is the last question, and I'm speak for everybody, but it was such a pleasure for you to come on here and just educate us and tell us all these just really cool and fascinating things.
Delighted. And I will find out about the advertising agencies, and I'll drop you a line, Joe. Perfect.
Thank you. And thank you, Tommy, for supporting her and filling her water from the sidelines. We appreciate that.
I promise everything is still in the archive. Nothing to business, I promise.
You guys will be seeing plenty of Tommy. Tommy knows everything about Irish whiskey. You guys are going to be learning so much from Tommy, you're going to get tired of seeing him. But no, I'm just kidding. You can't Tommy. But no, thank you so much, Carol, and thank you so much, Tommy, and thank you so much, Lush Life and Portland Cocktail Week, and of course, Jameson Black Barrel for doing this and coming together and putting this on for you guys. And thank you to all of you for even being interested in the first place. A lot of you applied to be here, and only 50 of you got in, and that says a lot. So we really appreciate you being interested in furthering your education with Irish whiskey. Wish you all the best of luck, because as you guys know, some of you are going to go on to maybe get to go to Ireland, depending on how all this works out. But I'm excited to see how this goes for you guys. And of course, if you enjoyed this class, for the viewers that are on there too, not just the students, please hit the like or the love button and give some love in the comments like you have. If you want to see Portland Cocktail Week put on more classes like this, of course, then let us know and give us a follow on Facebook, facebook.com/PDXCW. These will be popping up on your screen too, or YouTube at youtube.com/PDXCW. Also, of course, socials. You know how it is these days, guys. 2026, we got to give the follows. We got to share for the optics and get to know each other on the social medias. PDXCW, Lush Life Productions on Instagram. Of course, Jameson US has a page too. And I am Make Dram Sure on social media. If you want to see all the goofy stuff that I'm up to, I'm happy to follow you back and engage with you a little bit. Now, tomorrow you guys will break off and you're going to learn a little bit more. But next Tuesday, for those of you that are following along who aren't in the cohort, we have a very, very special guest. We have the master distiller himself coming on screen. He's going to be joining Tommy, and I will be replaced by my lovely friend Maeve, because I will be busy in North Carolina with Jack Rose. Shout out to Jack Rose. But they will be on screen next week, and you're going to learn so much cool stuff about the secrets of Irish whiskey distillation. So looking forward to that, and looking forward to you guys getting to meet Kevin. He's a legend. And I guess that's going to be it for me, folks. And I hope you have a good rest of your day. Have a good shift. And as always, stay curious. Cheers.
Bye, Joe. Bye, everyone.
Bye.
Bye.